I'm Dr. Nikki McDaniel, and I'm going to be walking you through this course. I want to start by describing a little bit of where this whole journey is going to take us. It's certainly not going to cover every aspect of sexuality, but I hope that I'm choosing the most important things for us to explore together. We're going to start today by talking about sex and genetic diversity. This is using the biological theory of evolution to help explain what sexual differences exist and why. We're going to move on from there to how our sex is determined and how our bodies differentiate sexually. Then we're going to talk about adult sexual anatomy and physiology, and then the consequences of sex, including pregnancy. Then we're going to move more into a psychological realm of sexuality, and we're going to talk about how our psychological side develops, our sense of gender and orientation, and in general, our place in the world. And after we've talked about that very individual process, we're going to move to talk about things that are really about our sexuality and our relationship with society, and ending on sexual relationships. Before we dive into the diversity aspect of sexuality, I want to take a moment to introduce a slide that I'm going to bring up many times as we talk about sexuality. These sexuality circles help to illustrate just how complex sexuality is. There are so many facets, so many aspects to sexuality that it's very difficult to describe it as a whole. So if you look at these circles, you'll see things that perhaps you already identify with sexuality. Our gender identity and orientation, our sexual behaviors, the things we do and who we do them with, our degree of intimacy with others, like how safe we feel getting close to others, our health, which includes our sexual health, but also our general physical health, our access to education and what that education entails, our sensuality, the way we experience touch and physical connection. And all of these things are connected through what's called power and agency, because this influences how we experience and how we identify in each of the other circles. Now, let me say something about each of these. Power is how much power the culture or society gives you as a result of your sexuality, for instance. Let's consider that in the United States and in many countries around the world, men have more power than women. They earn more, they have more voice, maybe not an individual man, but on the whole, if you look at how our government is made up, it's very clear that it's male dominated. Men have more power. So if you're a woman and you have less power, that's going to influence how you experience all of these other circles compared to men. Now, agency is similar to power, but agency really means your ability to make your own decisions, to choose your own direction. And it is quite possible to have power without agency. So, to use the example of men in the United States, while they may have more power, men in the United States do not have as much agency as would be ideal. Because if they want to express emotions or things that we consider feminine traits, they feel constrained. They know that there will be consequences or repercussions if they do something that falls outside of the masculine. So keep these in mind, and when you're thinking about the complexity of sexuality or some aspect of it, remember that each one of these influences the others. Okay, so let's start with, why do we reproduce? Why is this body system even here? And the answer is fairly obvious. No one individual of any species can live forever. Therefore, we reproduce in order that the species may survive, so that life goes on. Now, does all reproduction require sex? No. Many species use what's called asexual reproduction. And what we see here is an organism that gets lonely, decides that it's going to create a friend, starts to grow its little friend here off to the side. Now you can see they look very similar, and then they separate, and voila, we now have two individuals. The thing about asexual reproduction, though, is that these two individuals are genetically identical. That means that they have the same genetic traits, the same advantages and the same disadvantages in any given situation. They're not different. Now, sexual reproduction involves the mixing of genetic material from two parents. So here you see a human egg and some human sperm. Each one is carrying half the DNA that all the other cells in that adult human have. And when the two come together, the resulting cell will have the full set of DNA, the full set of chromosomes. So this is definitely more complicated. Not only do we have to find a mate, but we also, in forming eggs or sperm, have to pick which half of the DNA we send along. So if it's so complicated, why do we bother? So it's all about genetic diversity. The more genetically similar individuals in a species are, the more they share the advantages and potential disadvantages. And that means, and by the way, this is meant to be genetically similar individuals in a population. But what that means is if something happens in the external environment, some sort of environmental crisis, some change in temperature, some exposure to chemical, kind of infection, if it kills off one of those individuals and all the individuals share the same advantages and disadvantages, then whatever that change is likely to kill off the entire population, potentially the entire species. This is not helping the species to continue. However, when we use sexual reproduction and we create genetic diversity, it gives the species as a whole greater resilience. So the more diverse the population is, the more likely that at least some individuals will survive when there's a change in the environment that challenges that population. So whatever this change is might kill off some individuals, but the other individuals in the species are likely or more likely to survive because they're different, and that allows them to reproduce. So the survival of any species depends on generating diversity, not tolerating diversity, but actually making sure diversity happens. Now, where this happens is in our chromosomes, in our genes. Our chromosomes contain our genes. Our genes are the recipes to make proteins, and the proteins that we make are the things that give us our traits. They're the things that do the work in the cell. They're the things that build the structures that are part of our body. So all of these genes lead to proteins, and the proteins make us who we are, whether we can see the trait or not. By the way, before I move on, chromosome is probably the most mispronounced word in biology. It actually just refers to what these look like on a microscope. Chromo means colored. Some means body, which is kind of an old-fashioned way of saying thingy. So when the early biologists looked through the microscope at this cell that was preparing to divide, and they put some colored stain on it so they could see it better, they were like, ooh, what are those colored thingies? I don't know. Let's call them colored thingies until we find out. And there we have the word chromosome. Now, chromosomes are like our cells' cookbooks. Each chromosome contains a huge number of genes or recipes. So you can think of each one of these as being like a volume of a cookbook. Now, this cookbook is huge. Humans have over 25,000 genes. So imagine having a cookbook with 25,000 recipes. You'd probably never open it. Okay, so we don't just have one cookbook with 25,000 recipes. That would be such an enormous book that we wouldn't be able to move it on the countertop to even open it and make something. So we break our cookbook into volumes, like you would see with an encyclopedia, for instance, in the library. Now, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. That's because when we were born, we inherited one copy of volume 1 or chromosome 1 from our mother and another copy of chromosome 1 from our father. So we actually have 2 copies of volume 1 or chromosome 1. And overall, we have 23 different volumes. We just have one version from mom and one version from dad. Now, what this means when we say we have 2 copies of chromosome number 1 does not mean that they are exactly the same. They all contain the same recipes, but the specific recipes may be slightly different. For instance, if you had 2 actual cookbooks and each one had a recipe for oatmeal cookies, it could be different. One might have a little more butter that you're supposed to add. One might tell you to add raisins. So while both are a recipe for oatmeal cookies, they can have differences in terms of how those oatmeal cookies look once you've made them. Same thing for our genes. Okay, so we have essentially a 23 volume cookbook that has all 25,000 recipes in it. But because we got DNA from both of our parents, we actually have 2 sets of these cookbooks, one from our mother and one from our father. When an egg or sperm is formed, it only gets one set of cookbooks because when they come together, we want them to have the right number. So the egg has 23 cookbooks, the sperm has 23 cookbooks, and when they come together, the resulting cell has 2 sets of 23 cookbooks, which is the right number for each of our cells to have. Now, how do our cells decide which cookbook volume to give each gamete, each sperm or egg? So we've got a cell that has 46 chromosomes in it, but when it becomes sperm, when it divides and becomes 2 different cells to become sperm or eggs, it's only allowed to pass on 23. Because if it passed on all 46 and then it met up with an egg or a sperm that also had 46, suddenly we would have 92 chromosomes to deal with. And if you were overwhelmed with the idea of a cookbook set that was 23 volumes long and having 2 of them, imagine if you had 4. All right, so our cells actually don't decide. Here we see a cell that is getting ready to divide to produce either sperm or eggs. So if you look at the resulting cells, you can see that they have half the number of chromosomes that the parent cell did. Now this diagram only has 2 pairs of chromosomes because if we were to put in all 23 pairs, I would need a much bigger slide to show you what was happening. So when they line up like this, all the chromosomes line up in a row and they sit side by side with their matched pair, they line up randomly. So in this version of the cell division, the big blue chromosome is on the left and the big red chromosome is on the right. The little ones are opposite. But just as easily, it could have lined up so that the blue chromosomes were on the left for both pairs and the red were on the right. The result, when it lines up randomly, is that let's say the cell splits right down the middle here. So this one will have big blue and little red. This one will have big red and little blue. But just as easily, it could have been big blue, and big red, little red. And the same thing happens in our cells. Now, I know some of you don't like math, but I'm going to give this to you anyway. Trust me, you don't have to repeat it. But in this example, where we have 2 chromosomes and we have 2 copies of each, one from mom, one from dad, what that means is that we have 2 to the second power of possible combinations, or 4 total possible combinations. It's not very impressive, is it? But we have 23 chromosomes. So we have a lot more possibilities. Now, I want you to imagine that our chromosomes are like a deck of cards where we have black suits and red suits, and we're going to pair them up. We're going to say that the black ones are dad and the red ones are mom. Now, there are 52 cards in a deck, so let's take 6 away so that we have the right number, which is 46. So, if we line these up as if they were chromosomes in a cell preparing to divide, this is what it might look like. So, all of them lined up, in this case with, dads on top and moms on the bottom. I'm not going to rearrange them, but I want you to imagine that for each pair, we randomly pick either black or red. We randomly pick either dad's or mom's version of the cookbook. So, that means that if we randomly choose, we could have this combination, or this combination, or this combination. This could go on for a long time. If we do the math, what we have is 2 copies of 23 chromosomes, and that gives us 2 to the 23rd power. That's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, 23 times, or 8,388,608 different possible combinations of chromosomes. That seems like it would be plenty of diversity, right? I mean, over 8 million different possible things just with one sperm or egg. But biology doesn't stop there. Chromosomes, when they line up next to each other, also randomly swap genes. So here we have the chromosome that we got from mom and the chromosome we got from dad. And these letters represent the genes, the recipes that are in there. We just use letters instead of writing out oatmeal cookies. Now, while they're together and waiting for everybody else to get lined up before the cell divides, they're like, oh, hey, I have GHI. You have GHI? Cool. Hey, you want to swap? And they do. So now we have one copy of mom's chromosome that's all mom's genes. We have one copy of mom's chromosome that is mostly mom and a little bit of dad. We have one copy of dad's chromosome that's mostly dad but a little bit mom, and one that's all dad. And each one of these is going to end up in one of the sperm or eggs that's reproduced. So for each cell division, this happens about 55 times in males and 75 times in females. Now remember, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so that means that each pair is doing this more than twice with each cell division. If you were standing next to your identical twin and just decided to swap limbs, it's the equivalent of that. And it's happening multiple places in each chromosome pair. So now our playing cards aren't just dad or mom. We have dad or mom and mostly dad, little mom, and mostly mom, little dad. But it still doesn't stop there. So in addition to that, chromosomes also do a number of other things to change their structure. Sometimes you'll have 2 chromosomes next to each other, and one will simply give a chunk of itself to the other one. So whatever genes used to be in this volume of the cookbook are now in a different volume of the cookbook. Sometimes chromosomes will just eliminate or delete a chunk of DNA, and those genes are gone. Sometimes they will take a chunk of DNA and they'll duplicate it. So now one volume of your cookbook has the same recipes twice, or at least some of them. And finally, sometimes chromosomes will take a chunk of DNA and flip it so that now all of the genes are backwards. Now, some of these changes result in mutations that are so severe that the cell can't survive. But sometimes it generates diversity. It creates new traits that actually may give that individual advantages or disadvantages in its lifetime. So, thinking about all the different ways that we can have different possibilities, if we wanted to calculate it, we would have to consider the number of possible combinations of partners on the Earth, the number of possible combinations of chromosomes just from how they line up before they divide, and the number of different ways that they might swap their DNA while they're waiting. And when you consider all of those possibilities, it really becomes impossible to calculate how many possibilities there are. You are absolutely 1000% unique, and so are we all. Now, genetic diversity is vital because it randomly generates new traits. It's almost like our DNA is trying to make mistakes because sometimes mistakes turn out to be beneficial. So some combinations are advantageous. They give an individual advantages in terms of surviving and being able to reproduce. Some are disadvantageous. Individuals with advantageous traits are more likely to reproduce. Those with disadvantageous traits, or without the advantageous ones, are less likely to reproduce successfully. Over time, the ones that have the advantages and tend to reproduce are going to, those advantages, the genes that they have, are going to start to appear more and more frequently in the population. And so we say that the genetic profile of the entire population has changed. This new advantageous trait is now more common. And this is essentially what we are talking about when we talk about evolution. Now, all living things evolve. You've probably heard about antibiotic resistance. This is an example of evolution. So in this first circle, we see that most of the bacteria are orange, which is normal. But there is one, because it just had a random mutation, because its DNA was playing around while it was waiting to divide, that gives that bacterium resistance, or the ability to resist or not get killed by antibiotics. So if all of these bacteria are then exposed to antibiotics, all of the orange ones die, but the blue one doesn't. And when it's allowed to replicate again, all of its offspring are now going to have antibiotic resistance. Right? The genetic profile of the population has changed. Over here, the gene that did not give resistance was the most common. But after this change in the environment, the trait that was advantageous appears much more frequently in the population. So this is an example of evolution. We also see it in human skin color. Humans originated near the equator in Africa. And near the equator, the sun is very strong. The UV light is very strong. And UV light can cause skin cancer. So our skin back then was very dark in order to prevent damage to our skin cells. Now, why not just cover up? One, because it's so hot, and two, because we need to be exposed to sunlight our skin needs to be exposed to sunlight in order to produce vitamin D. Now, and vitamin D is essential for our metabolism. So what happened is that humans started to migrate away from the equator. And as they moved far north or far south, where the climate was colder and had less sunshine, those humans, were either because they were covering up to stay warm or simply because the days were shorter, were producing less vitamin D, and this was making them sick. Now, some of those individuals randomly had mutations that caused them to stop producing melanin, the pigment that makes our skin brown. And that mutation gave them an advantage because it meant that whenever their skin was exposed to the sunlight, the melanin wasn't preventing the light from getting into the skin to make the vitamin D. So it gave them an advantage. Over time, populations of humans that moved farther north developed lighter and lighter skin, whereas those that still resided near the equator kept their darker skin because that was an advantage in that environment. So this is another case of evolution. Now, what does any of this have to do with sexuality? Well, there's a very prominent notion that there is a right way for the human body to be, that the evolution is somehow aiming for an ideal, more perfect form. You've all seen that picture of evolution that goes from an ape to gradually a modern human, but that's not reflective of how evolution works at all. Evolution doesn't have any idea what the perfect form would even be. How could we know when the environment around us is constantly changing? So, depending on how it changed, one way may be ideal and another way not. So, when we have this idea that evolution is striving for perfection, it also means that we begin to think that natural variations, natural diversity in our traits are often labeled as deformities or disorders by medicine, by media, by society. But the truth is that all of the differences between each one of us is what biology and what evolution is trying to create. Nature's always gambling because we don't know which combination is going to allow the species to survive. Now, gambles don't always pay off for individuals. Some individuals are born with mutations that create very difficult, challenging, even painful lives or shorter lives. Evolution doesn't care about us as individuals. Evolution is gambling to make sure that the species survives. So, instead of looking at people who are, different, instead of looking at our diversity as something that is bad, like somebody failed to be normal or perfect, we should really look at the differences between us as the biological gambles that we are and celebrate our differences because we understand that this is evolution's way of making sure our species goes on.